This episode of Lex Out Loud is brought to you by the patrons of Starwalker Studios. Learn how you can support the show at starwalkerstudios.com/support. Hello and welcome to episode 27 of Lex Out Loud, Writing Science Fiction. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. This podcast chronicles the journey of creating my third novel, my first science fiction novel. Today, I ponder the question, is less realistic sci-fi more approachable? But before we try to answer that question, just a few things here at the beginning of the show. First of all, I like to let you all know what I'm kind of bringing in as far as creative inspiration or influences, what I'm watching, what I'm reading, what I'm playing. So as far as what I'm watching, the only thing new to report is I recently saw the movie The Tomorrow War, which I actually really enjoyed. In fact, I enjoyed it quite a bit more than I expected that I would. I went into it expecting at best a just kind of fun popcorn movie. And by that, I just mean kind of a movie where you just shut off your brain and enjoy the explosions and the action and eat your popcorn and don't really think about things too much. But I enjoyed it more than I thought I would, and it was a much better movie than I expected. Now, there are some things as far as the kind of premise and setup of the movie, which is all revealed in the first few minutes of the movie, that let's just say don't seem very plausible, even for a science fiction movie. But if you're willing to just suspend your disbelief about the plausibility of what they're doing and would that really happen, and is that how people would really handle this situation, if you can get past that and just kind of accept that for what it is, other than that, it's a great movie. It's really well done. It's got some humorous elements. It's got some kind of powerful emotional elements to it. It's got some heart to it. It's got some great action, some great acting. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. So I recommend it. But I do warn you that if you're someone who, everything has to be super realistic and plausible, that this may not be the movie for you. The setup is a little, implausible, I think, to just say it simply. And once you see the movie, you'll know what I'm talking about. But if you can just suspend your disbelief about that, which, I mean, you're also required to suspend your disbelief about time travel. So, it shouldn't be too much harder than that, I wouldn't think. If you can do that, you'll enjoy it quite a bit. Unfortunately, I haven't found anything new or recent to watch on TV, which is unfortunate because we've been kind of lacking for anything good to watch here in the Starwalker house. As far as what I'm reading, I haven't started it, but my next book I'm going to read as far as fiction is Fugitive Telemetry by Martha Wells, which is actually a novella in the Murderbot series. So if you follow me on Twitter or you're in our Discord, you probably already know that I'm a huge fan of Murderbot. I really enjoy those books. Most of those books are actually novellas. There's only been one bona fide novel in the series so far. That one, I believe, was called Network Effect. So if you're someone that doesn't have a lot of time to read, but you're wanting, some entertaining space opera to read, I highly recommend the series. And like I said, most of the books are novellas, so they're much shorter than novels. You can get through them in an afternoon easy on the weekend. So yeah, if you're looking for something a little shorter in length, I highly recommend it. And even if you're not, even if you're just looking for some good space opera, I highly recommend the Murderbot books. And, it's probably not super important that you read them in order. They each seem fairly self-contained. There is some carryover and whatnot. So definitely if you want the best experience, I would recommend reading them in order. But if you just grab one, whichever one you have access to and want to read it, I think you'll be fine. It's not the kind of story where there's a whole lot of background you really need to understand. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy those books. I just, I think it was yesterday, I just finished The Elements of Style, which is a grammar book that I've been reading. And I realized in the previous episode when I talked about it, I didn't really say much about it as far as what it is. It's a very thin book. There's not much to it. And it's another book you could easily read in an afternoon if you wanted to. So the first section of the book is just kind of rules of writing, kind of do's and don'ts, best practice kind of stuff as far as writing clearly and powerfully in English. And then the next part of the book is a collection of words and phrases that are commonly misused or mistakenly used, or mistakes are made. A couple examples of these kinds of things are when to use the word affect versus the word effect, when to use the word farther versus the word further, things like that. So they're all alphabetized, and it's just this kind of laundry list of very common mistakes that are made and the right way to do things. So it's a very easy book to just kind of read a little bit here, a little bit there. It's also great as a reference. If you're confused about, do I use effect or affect, or do I use farther or further? It's really easy to look those things up in these common mistakes. And yeah, I mean, I'm someone who always felt I was very well versed in grammar. I've never had problems with grammar as a writer. It's one of my strengths. I think my first drafts tend to be a lot cleaner than a lot of writers' final drafts. And that's just, we all have our strengths and weaknesses. I'm not saying I'm better than anyone else, but just grammar and punctuation and spelling and things like that are just some of the things that I'm particularly good at. So when I read this, I wasn't really expecting to see anything new or really learn anything, but I just wanted to check it out. But I actually did learn quite a few things from the book. Not really anything I'd say that was new as far as a rule or a way of doing things that I didn't know about, but it was more explanations for why things are done the way they are, and why a lot of the things for me were kind of instinctive. Like I didn't really know the rule or why it is that way. I just knew what sounded right to me and let my ear kind of guide me, and it was guiding me in the right direction. So it was really interesting and useful to learn why the correct way is the correct way. Now, this is actually a very old book that's been revised numerous times, and there were a few things in there that to me seemed a little outdated. Some words that they recommended not using that have since become acceptable, things like that. But not very many of those. Maybe, I'd say less than 5, 5 or less. So for the most part, it was still relevant, and I think you'll know those things when you see them. So highly recommend that if you're writing in English, especially the section on the common mistakes was really helpful. As far as what I'm playing, nothing new. But I just recently started playing some No Man's Sky again. I've been playing No Man's Sky off and on since the game was launched. I tend to play it for a bit and then get bored with it, and then I'll take months off and let because they release sizable updates to that game every few months. So you take 6 or 9 months off or a year off, and now there's new things to do and new things to experience. And so that's kind of where I am now. It's been about a year, I think, since the last time I played it. So there's quite a few new things that I haven't experienced yet that have been added since I played it last. So I've been playing a little of that. I'm kind of in a similar situation with video games as I am with TV shows, where I don't have anything new to play, and all the stuff I've had, I'm kind of bored with at this point. So, yeah, really, really looking forward to some new games to play. I don't know when that'll happen. I play on a PlayStation 4, and then would love to get a PlayStation 5, but they're almost impossible to get unless you want to pay a scalper for one, which I refuse to do for obvious reasons, I hope. But yeah, so until I can pick one of those up, I don't know that there's really much new to play. And, to get these new games that are coming out that you can theoretically play on PS4, they don't play so well on PS4, especially because I have the original PS4. I don't have the Pro version. So, these newer games that are coming out now that are claiming to be playable on PS4, they're really not if you have the original version. They take forever to load, and there's lots of popping and things like that. And it's like I was playing No Man's Sky the other night, and it's like, I land somewhere on a planet and I have to just sit in my ship for like 2 or 3 minutes to let everything load so I can actually see what's around me when I get out of my ship. So that's not remotely ideal. So, that's really unfortunate that they're doing it that way. If something says it's playable on PS4, then it should be playable on PS4. And that to me is not. But yeah, so until I can get a PS5, I may just not have new games to play. And from the sound of things, those may not be readily available until the second half of 2022, if then. So it may be a while. But at least I can leave the house now so I can do other things other than sit around and play video games. So yeah, that's what I've been doing as far as recreational things. Not much to report there. As far as kind of a quick update on the book, I finished, or I shouldn't say I finished, but I've greatly fleshed out my main villain or my main antagonist. I think in the last episode I talked about how I'd finally come up with some really good ideas for that character, and I've since then kind of filled in the blanks there and have a really solid framework of this character and the role that he's going to play in the story. I'm really excited about that. I went through everything I've written this far and decided and organized what of that is going to be part of this prequel story and what's going to be part of the first book. About 2/3 of what I had written so far was prequel stuff, and then the other third was stuff that will go into the first book. And probably the most exciting thing I've done since the last time I spoke with you is I was able to write a plot synopsis for the first book. Finally, it needs to be streamlined. It's 2 or 3 paragraphs long. It's almost a page long. Which is way too long for a plot synopsis. But, I now know the overall plot of the book, which is not to say I do not know how it ends. I basically know the situation of the first book and the problem that has to be overcome. But as far as how that's going to happen, at this point, I really don't know. So yeah, I've got that. And that was really exciting because that put me at the point where I felt like I could really start writing this first book in earnest. At least 2/3 of what I've written so far is kind of what I consider pre-writing, is stuff that probably won't be in the actual first book. So it just feels really good. And I did start with chapter 1, so it felt really good to write chapter 1, which I have completed at this point. So I do have chapter 1 of the book done, which is awesome. Now I just kind of decide what happens in chapter 2. Yeah, so that's pretty exciting. And that's kind of where I'm at on that. So what I wanted to really talk about today on the show is this question that I asked at the very top of the show. And the question is less realistic sci-fi more approachable? And I want to hear from you on this because I don't have an answer for this question today. This episode is not an answer to that question. This episode is an exploration of the question itself, because this is something I've started asking myself recently. So is less realistic sci-fi more approachable? Another way to ask this question would be to invert it. You probably know I love to invert questions. I don't know why. And explore the opposite question at the same time. So the inversion of this question would be, is hard sci-fi less approachable? Now, that's interesting, right? Because I feel like if I ask the question, is less sci-fi or is hard sci-fi less approachable than not hard sci-fi? I think most people, if not everybody, would say, yes, it is less approachable. And I don't know that there'd even be much of a discussion. Even diehard fans of hard sci-fi, and I don't know this. I haven't polled thousands of people to have a sample group and know, but my feeling from my life and what I've heard people say throughout my life is that even among the diehard fans of hard sci-fi, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who would make the claim that hard sci-fi is as approachable as other forms of sci-fi. I think most people would agree that hard sci-fi is less approachable than, say, space opera or other forms of sci-fi that are not hard sci-fi. In fact, I think it'd probably be hard to find someone who genuinely believes that it's not less approachable. So the answer to that question seems obvious, but when I flip it around and when I ask kind of the same question from a different angle and I ask, is less realistic sci-fi more approachable? Then I'm not so sure. So I'm really curious what you think. So let's dig into this more. Let's unpack this more, kind of what I'm talking about, where I'm coming from. And let's start off with having some more discussion about genres and subgenres. And I've kind of had a change of heart to some degree about this stuff fairly recently in the last, I don't know, few weeks or month or two, just due to some stuff I've read on Wikipedia and whatnot. So this may sound a little different than things you've heard me say in the past, but we're always learning and growing. So there you go. So personally, I think arguing about subgenres in science fiction, and people do argue about this, hardly a day goes by that I don't see someone on Twitter trying to argue about this. To me, that's one of the sillier things in the world to argue about. And this is coming from someone who has argued about them in the past, and maybe even I have on the show. I'm not sure. I've made the argument that Star Wars is more fantasy than science fiction, for instance, and that's usually a great way to get a discussion or a debate going in a mixed group of people. Is just stand on your soapbox and say Star Wars is fantasy, not science fiction, and you'll probably get a debate going. You'll probably have some people that take issue with that. Or maybe not. I don't know. Maybe that's kind of the mainstream opinion now. I don't know. Didn't used to be, but I've made that argument in the past. But really, it's a silly thing to argue about. And this is something I've come to realize recently. Terms like space opera, hard sci-fi, mundane sci-fi, military sci-fi, fantasy, dystopian, utopian, urban fantasy, epic fantasy, romantic fantasy, I don't know. All these terms are really only useful in describing types of stories so that the reader has some idea of what they're getting into when they buy a book or they buy a story. If you tell me this story is space opera, that gives me some idea of what to expect. Or if you tell me it's hard sci-fi or military sci-fi or urban fantasy, right? It just gives me some idea what to expect, but it doesn't tell me exactly what to expect because these terms aren't very well defined and they're not, there's a lot of crossover between them. They're not like discrete boxes where you can say, oh, this is definitely this and it can't be that. Most stories that you think of, you could probably argue might be in one or more different subgenres of either fantasy or sci-fi, whatever it is. So, those terms are useful because they can help me as a reader have some idea what I'm getting into when I'm looking at a book or a story I might want to read. They're also kind of more to the point, helpful for marketing departments of publishers so that they can have somewhat of a shorthand to communicate to the reader what kind of story this is. This is kind of tangentially relevant to this, and I'm not going to go into this, but the book cover is a big part of this too. The art of the book cover does a lot to tell you what kind of story this is, what subgenre it might be, what to expect. Like you can usually tell from a book cover if it's a romance or not, for instance, a bodice ripper, as they say. So the cover is part of that too. But yeah, the genre or subgenre is useful for marketing so that we can put this book in front of people who might actually be interested in it. So for instance, if your book is a hard sci-fi, you have people out there that want nothing to do with hard sci-fi. And so if I'm someone like that and I buy a book thinking I'm getting space opera and it turns out to be hard sci-fi, I'm not going to be happy, right? I'm not going to be happy with that book and I'm going to regret buying it because I'm going to be like, if I would have known what kind of book this was, I would have never bought it because I don't read hard sci-fi. I don't like hard sci-fi. So that's how those terms are useful for readers and for marketers and therefore for writers, because of course we want our books to be read by people who are wanting to read the kind of book that we wrote. So if I wrote a hard sci-fi, then the last thing I want is for someone who hates hard sci-fi to pick up my book and start reading it thinking it's a space opera, because A, they're not going to like it because they don't like hard sci-fi to begin with, and B, they're going to like it even less because it's not what they expect. They're expecting space opera, which they do like, and they're getting hard sci-fi, which they don't like. So, people are really quick to say, to disparage these subgenres and I don't know what they think. Like, we're going to have a world without subgenres where you don't classify things. How would that work? But yeah, don't be so quick to disparage these things because they do have their purpose and they serve those purposes. The problem is that these things aren't rigidly defined and that there are so many stories that blur these lines even more than they're already blurred, that don't fit into these subgenres, that are kind of a blend of different ones, or might even be a blend of sci-fi and fantasy. So yeah, debating what subgenre of sci-fi or fantasy a given book is pretty silly. It's a silly thing to argue about because ultimately it kind of comes down to a matter of opinion. And you could have two people make two very different arguments about the same story and both be good arguments because, again, these things aren't rigidly defined. So it's kind of a silly thing to argue about. And I've always known that, but what I recently came to realize is even the distinction between science fiction and fantasy is a pretty silly thing to argue about. And the reason is because that distinction between science fiction and fantasy is a fairly modern distinction. There was a time when that distinction didn't exist. So if you go and research the history of science fiction, for instance, or fantasy for that matter, I assume I haven't researched that. But as I did, I was like, I want to learn more about, how did science fiction as a genre come to be? And you start reading about it. And the first thing you learn is that, again, there's a debate. There's not even agreement over what was the first science fiction novel or what was the first science fiction story. There's not agreement. People debate, which were the first sci-fi stories, which were the first sci-fi novels. But many of those stories and novels that are put forward as this could be the first one were considered fantasy in their time. So at the time that these early stories were written, the people of that day considered it fantasy if they considered it anything at all. There was no such thing as science fiction. So in a sense, with this historical context, really all sci-fi is a form of fantasy. You could say that sci-fi, science fiction, is a subgenre of fantasy, and I think that's accurate. I don't know I don't know who decides these things or, who thinks they have authority in these matters. I don't know if those people consider science fiction to be a subgenre of fantasy, but I do, and I think it should be if you look at the historical context. So anyway, I'm not here to debate about what was the first sci-fi novel or what was the first sci-fi story or when did science fiction become its own thing and wasn't fantasy anymore. I'm not here to debate any of that because honestly, none of that is important. At the end of the day, really all that's important is finding the best label for your book so that you can connect or get it in front of readers who are interested in that kind of book. That's what matters at the end of the day. All the rest of this stuff is kind of academic. But I think that the real takeaway here is that these terms aren't well defined. Not only are things like space opera and hard sci-fi and mundane sci-fi not well defined, but even terms like science fiction and fantasy themselves aren't well defined. I mean, there are works we could argue, is this science fiction or is it fantasy? And you'll have people on both sides. There is not agreement among writers, readers, scholars, editors, or publishers as to how certain works should be categorized. So, although saying a book is mundane science fiction or space opera will probably give a reader a better idea of what to expect than if you just said it's sci-fi, it's really not worth arguing over what specific subgenre a certain book or story should be, in my opinion. What's even more interesting to me, though, is the question of whether I should put more fantastical elements in my stories, which is what is bringing me to the question today, which is, does making a sci-fi story less realistic actually make it more approachable to more people? I mean, for one thing, it seems that these kind of fantastical elements have had a home in science fiction since inception, since the very beginning, especially considering that, a lot of these stories that people consider to be the first science fiction were actually fantasy. Now, obviously, fantasy stories are going to be fantastical, but the science fiction ones are too, oftentimes. When I look at the science fiction that's popular right now, that's in the mainstream, it seems like most of it, if not all of it, I think all of it, has a pretty strong fantastical element. It's not hard sci-fi. The only hard sci-fi I can think of that's had any kind of wide appeal is The Martian. That's one movie. And even that, I don't know that there were that many people that weren't science fiction fans that went and saw The Martian. I kind of doubt it. And of those, how many of them really loved it? I don't know. Maybe Interstellar, that was fairly hard sci-fi too. And that seemed fairly popular, but was it really mainstream popular, or was it just very popular among people that love sci-fi? I don't know. But, you look at the stuff that is obviously popular, that is obviously mainstream, and it all has very strong fantastical elements. It is not hard sci-fi or anything remotely close to hard sci-fi. So whether those fantastical elements are super advanced technology that might as well be magic, or an actual fantasy element like psychic powers or superpowers of some kind, all these really popular science fiction stories have these elements. So, Star Trek, pretty popular. You've got all this technology that's so advanced and breaks the laws of physics as we understand them that it's, for all intents and purposes, it's magic. Star Wars, also very popular. I mean, you straight up have magic in Star Wars. It doesn't even try to disguise it as technology in the Force. But also the quote technology of Star Wars is very magical too. The hyperdrive of Star Wars is even more ridiculously fast than the warp drive of Star Trek. And there is zero attempt made to explain it. And in fact, within the setting, it said that people don't actually understand how it works. It's been around for tens of thousands of years. No one even knows who invented it. So yeah, it's very hand wavy, just magic. And then, if you consider like all these superhero stories to be science fiction, which I would argue, but again, these labels, again, my whole point is it's not really worth arguing about. But if you want to call like all these Marvel movies and DC movies and shows like The Boys and whatnot, if you want to call that science fiction, then those all have fantastical elements as well in the form of superpowers. And, I know especially Marvel loves to come up with these really stupid pseudoscience explanations for their superpowers that are ridiculous to anyone that's had more than elementary school science. But at the end of the day, they're magic powers, right? And we all know that. And the feeble attempt to give it a veneer of pseudoscience doesn't really change that. They're very fantastical elements. So yeah, when I try to think of movies and TV shows, which we're talking about popular culture, mainstream. So I feel like that kind of leaves books out because I don't think most people read, unfortunately. But most people do watch movies and TV. So if you look at TV shows and movies and you look at the science fiction that is popular, that is doing well, it all has these fantastical elements, with just a few exceptions. So some exceptions that I thought of in recent memory is the movie Stowaway, which I talked about in previous episode, which I just saw recently, which I really enjoyed, which I consider hard sci-fi. And, without getting into the nitty gritty of the physics, as a layperson, to me, I didn't see anything that seemed fantastical in that show. There was no magic. There was no ridiculous physics breaking technology or anything like that. It was all very realistic and plausible, which is the big reason I really enjoyed it. The big thing about it I really enjoyed. But that's unusual. And I don't know that movie was super popular. I don't think it was. I don't hear people talking about it much. And when I do, they're obvious sci-fi fans. Another one is the show Upload. So I'm not super well versed in virtual reality and program and artificial intelligence and some stuff like that. So I don't know. I'm sure some of the stuff in that show is pretty far-fetched, even saying it's as far in the future as it said it was, which I'm not sure how far in the future that show is. It doesn't seem like it's very far, like maybe a decade or two, something like that. So I don't know how realistic all that stuff was, but it didn't seem fantastical. It seemed believable, that within a relatively short amount of time, we would have technology that could do what we see in that show. I didn't see any, glaring fantastical elements in that. But a lot of the other stuff you do. So, I already mentioned various iterations of Star Trek and Star Wars all have these fantastical elements, some more than others. I would consider any kind of time travel a fantastical element, because other than using time dilation to go forward in time or go more quickly forward in time, as far as we know, time travel is not possible. So any kind of, Star Trek that involves time travel, where there's a fantastical element right there, not to mention warp drive, transporters, inertial dampeners, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on and on of their magic technology. The Expanse, which amusingly, terrible adverb there, but a lot of people online at least seem to think The Expanse is hard sci-fi, which I don't know why. It just always amuses me a little bit when I see that. I guess I find it amusing because to me, it just says what a low bar for realism it takes for someone to think something is hard sci-fi. And again, I think this is to the point I'm making here, because we're used to the science fiction that we see having such strong fantastical elements. When we see something like The Expanse, while it is still very much space opera, it is not hard sci-fi. The fantastical elements in The Expanse are more understated. They're less ridiculous, less magical, and they're less. There's less of them. So you contrast that with things like Star Trek and Star Wars, and people think they're seeing hard sci-fi, even when it's not, because the Epstein drive in The Expanse is not possible. That's space opera. That's not hard sci-fi. And there's other things as well, but that's the big one. But again, you don't have ships in The Expanse traveling faster than light. You don't have, things like transporters or lightsabers or inertial dampeners or shields that break the laws of physics. So, there's just these small, understated fantastical elements that are here and there, but it's so little compared to what we're used to that people think it's hard sci-fi, even when it's not. So I feel like that right there kind of makes my point for me. I could end the episode right now. Devs was a recent show that had some pretty strong fantastical elements involving time travel, among other things. And again, depending on if you consider it sci-fi or not, all the, the Marvel shows and movies, DC shows and movies, The Boys, Loki, Superman and Lois, all that stuff. If you consider that sci-fi, then all that stuff has, fantastical elements everywhere. To the degree that personally I would call those fantasy or modern fantasy. I would not call them sci-fi at all. So yeah, I'm curious what you think, if you agree with this. Maybe there's a whole ton of very popular hard sci-fi out there that I'm overlooking, but I don't think so. I'm sure a lot of people would say The Expanse, but The Expanse is not hard sci-fi. And the authors themselves have come down and said it's not hard sci-fi. So if you don't believe me, you can believe them. So my question here, the real question that I'm trying to answer or explore is, are these stories, all these fantastical, supposedly science fiction stories like Star Trek, Star Wars, The Expanse, superhero stories, are these more approachable to people, especially, and what I really mean is it's just everybody, people who aren't necessarily big rocket nerds or space exploration nerds or science fiction fans or scientists or physicists or astronomers or anything like that. Just your average everyday people who are not scientists, are not necessarily science fiction fans. Are these more fantastical shows more approachable to these people than hard or even mundane science fiction? I think that that's maybe the case. I mean, it seems to be, if only because there's so many more of them. And because for the most part, the ones that are really popular and mainstream all have these very strong fantastical elements, and there are loads of them. Like, I would say more fantastical elements than science fiction elements, even Star Trek. I feel like if we were to make a list, just take a given Star Trek episode and make a list of everything that we see that is fantastical, that violates the laws of physics as we understand them. And then we make a list of everything that we see that's actually scientifically plausible. I have a feeling that list of fantastical elements would be many, many, many times, probably 5 or more times longer than the list of actually scientifically plausible things. And in fact, we might not even, depending on the episode you picked or the movie you picked, there might not even be any scientifically plausible things. So I think maybe this is the case because, all of these more popular sci-fi shows are really more fantasy than sci-fi. So my hypothesis here is that is because, for whatever reason, they are more approachable to people who are not scientists, who are not science fiction fans, or at the very least, they're perceived as being more approachable. I think that maybe the truth of it is that some people, or a lot of people, are intimidated by more realistic sci-fi, by, quote, hard sci-fi, or even mundane sci-fi. The fantastical elements, I think, maybe make them feel more at home, make the material seem more relatable, more approachable, less intimidating, less elite, less like you need to have an education or a college degree to understand what's going on. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Now, if this is true, I kind of wonder if it's something like what I see happen with math all the time. I see this all the time with adults. Well, you see it with kids too, actually. But where you confront someone with some form of math, and I'm not talking about calculus here or even trigonometry. I'm talking about simple, addition or subtraction or figuring sales tax or a percentage, or doing a conversion from metric to standard, or a simple algebra operation, just something like that, like pretty basic level math. But if you just hit someone with something like that, so many times a person will just say, they'll just throw up their hands and say, I'm not good at math, or I don't do math, or I hate math, or I don't understand math, or whatever. And they don't even try. They don't even, for a fraction of a second, look at the thing you're showing them, whether it's an equation or whatever it is. And they don't even look at it and ask themselves, do I understand this, or can I figure it out? They don't even try. They just, as soon as they see numbers and symbols and pluses and minuses and fractions, as soon as they see any of that mathematical notation stuff, they just turn off and they say one of those things. I hate math. I don't do math. I'm terrible at math. I don't understand math. and they don't even try. They just give up before they even try. And I see this all the time. I used to, when I was in high school and college, for a long time, I worked at Subway's, the restaurant. And I was a shift leader and a manager. So I would train new employees all the time. And I would, teach them how to use the cash register and how to ring people up. And, as soon as anything remotely math related came up, people would just, and these were a lot of times people who were either in high school or in college. So these weren't even people who were adults who hadn't, been in a classroom for decades. These were people who were still in school, would just say, oh, I can't do math, So yeah, I've seen this so many times. So I kind of wonder if it's maybe the same kind of thing. If maybe encountering something that one perceives as hard sci-fi triggers that same kind of reflexive reaction as you see when someone's confronted with any form of math, where they don't even really look at the thing. They don't even try. They just say, I can't do this, or I don't like this, or I don't want this, or something like that. Because to me, there seems to be some similarity there. People just assume that something is beyond them without even trying to see if it really is or not. And that makes me sad. I always took it upon myself when that happened, when I was training people. A lot of times it was something like, we'd be working on the cash register and I'd ask them, like, kind of just trying to get across the idea of, like, you should always be thinking and engage with what's going on, and don't just trust the cash register. Think about what's happening. And if the total, is $15 in something, and someone gives you a 20, and you see the cash register telling you to give them 10 something back in change. Does that make sense? Does that seem right? Not asking people to do high level math in their head, but just ballpark stuff like, the bill is 15 something. They gave you a 20. Should they be getting more than $10 in change, or is there maybe something wrong here? And so many times people would just, oh, I can't do that. And I would always try to walk them through it to show them that, yes, actually you can do this. You're being lazy, frankly. Bluntly, they're being lazy and they're not even trying. But if they actually tried, more often than not, they could do it, and they did understand it. It just was too much effort, I guess. So this has all been kind of academic discussion, right? Is less realistic sci-fi more approachable to people? But really the reason for all this is I'm thinking about my story I'm writing, and I've been wanting very much to make it as realistic as possible. And really a big reason for that was my thought was that would make it more approachable to people. It would make it more believable. It would help people suspend their disbelief. It would help people understand what was going on. But I've begun wondering if maybe I'm completely backwards on that. And actually, if I want the story to be more approachable and for people to give it a shot, maybe I should really throw in some fantastical elements to make people feel a little more at home and less is expected of them. I don't know. I mean, ideally, I'd like to reach as wide an audience as I can. I mean, there are people that are just not going to enjoy a sci-fi story. But there are also a lot of people out there, I think, who normally don't read sci-fi and wouldn't read sci-fi. But if you got a story in front of them and you got them to read it, and if it was a good story, they could get into it and enjoy it. And that's the kind of thing I want to write, if it's possible. I don't want my audience just to be hardcore science fiction fans. I want it to be potentially anybody who likes a good story. So I think maybe like math, people are just intimidated by more realistic sci-fi or by something they perceive as hard sci-fi. Maybe the fantastical elements make them feel more at home, make the materials seem more relatable, more approachable, less intimidating, less cerebral, less academic, less like you need a bunch of letters after your name to understand it. What do you think? Am I onto something here, or am I off out in a tree somewhere? I don't know what the saying is. So if this is true, if hard sci-fi is perceived as less approachable, if just throwing some magical elements into an otherwise science fiction story makes it seem more approachable, then maybe it might behoove me to add something like that to my story. I was saying that I don't really consider books to be popular culture, but even in the books that I read, most of the science fiction books I read, they're either really hard on the space opera side of things, so there's all kinds of fantastical stuff, or there's at least some really fantastical stuff. It's very rare that I read a science fiction story that's straight up plausible, scientifically, plausible stuff. There's almost always fantastical elements thrown in. So, maybe this is something I should really consider doing, just to broaden my potential audience and just to make the story more approachable to people. So if I did do something like this, kind of what I've been thinking, because I don't want to turn it into space opera. I don't want to just throw magic into it. But what I could do is advance my timeline farther into the future than I was originally planning. This would result in artificial intelligence being much more powerful and ubiquitous. People would definitely be effectively immortal at that point. They'd be digital, and they might be settling the first star system other than our own, or at least they'd be close to doing that. So maybe by doing that, it would actually make it more approachable, more relatable, even though on the surface, it seems like that would do the opposite, right? Like it seems like a story set 200 years in the future would be more relatable and approachable than one set 1,000 years in the future. And yet the story set 1,000 years in the future could have all these fantastic elements and could seem less rooted in actual science and more just kind of like we're just making stuff up as we go. And maybe in that way, it would be more approachable to more people. I don't know. What do you think? Now, I realize that probably a lot of, or maybe even all of you listening to this are yourselves science fiction fans. So I might be talking to the choir here, but I'd really like to hear what you think. Do you care about the realism of a story? If you're reading a science fiction story, do you prefer one that's more true to science as we understand it and the laws of physics and is as realistic as possible? Or do you prefer one that has more fantastical elements? Or do you not care? Do you just in general prefer a story that's more realistic and believable? Or do you prefer something that's more magical and fantastical? Do you care about how relatable it is, how similar society is to what we have now? Another way to say it is if we're talking science fiction, do you prefer a story that's closer to our current time period as opposed to something that's farther in the future? A story where there's fewer and smaller differences as opposed to something like, say, Star Trek, where the world's completely different. So yeah, I'm really curious what you all think about this, what your preferences are, and whether you've seen these same trends and tendencies as I have, and what you think of my potential conclusions. And yeah, at the end of the day, what is your answer to the question, is less realistic sci-fi more relatable? Let me know what you think. So you're wondering, how do I do that? Well, a great way would be to join our Discord, and then you can speak with myself and other listeners and writers in real time. We have a lot of fun in there. You can find the link to join our Discord in the show notes for this at lexstarwalker.com/LOL. Also, you can email me at lexoutloudpodcast@gmail.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at lexstarwalker. I also have a voicemail you can call. That number is 951-465-5391. 951-465-5391. So yeah, plenty of ways for you to get a hold of me. Let me know what you think. I really would I'd love to hear from loads of people on this so I could even get a spread. Maybe you all won't agree, or maybe everyone will agree. Either way would be really interesting. So yeah, take a minute. Let me know what you think. And yeah, join us on Discord. It'd be great to have you in there, and you can keep up with what's going on. All right, so this one went a little long. Hopefully I can trim it down in the edit. But yeah, I find this really interesting to think about. And, ultimately I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to go where the muse takes me. I'm going to tell the best story I can, whatever that ends up being. So, I'm not going to take a left-hand turn just in the hopes of broadening my audience. But, if a simple little thing like just going a little farther in the future or having slightly more advanced technology would actually increase the relatability for people or decrease that perceived barrier to entry, it might be worth doing if that's really the case. So yeah, let me know what you think. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. All right. Well, that's going to wrap it up for me today. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll talk again soon. Until then, keep writing with or without fantastical elements.